Hello again. Today we're going to be starting our unit on decimals. So if you remember, a decimal is very similar to a fraction in that it represents a part out of a whole number. So for example, if I have 3 and a half, the fraction lets me know I have 1/2 of a whole. The decimal is very similar. If I have 3 and 5/10, that means I have 5/10 out of a whole. And we'll learn what each place value means later. But fractions let you know parts out of a whole. Decimals let you know parts out of a whole. Remember, a number is a decimal as long as it has that period or decimal point. So even this number 12 and 0/100 is a decimal just because it has that decimal point. Alright, so today we're going to be focusing on adding and subtracting decimals. So if you remember, a decimal is any number that has that decimal point. So I could have something like 4 and 5/10 plus 3 and 7/10. And I have some steps I'm going to follow. Step number 1 is always line up decimals. You're lining up all those decimal points. So I'm going to write it in stacked form. So I have 4.5 and I'm lining up that decimal. So I see I have 3 and that decimal from that 3 and 7/10 is going to be right underneath. And then I'm just going to add them together. 5 plus 2, so that is my next step. Step number 2 is I just add or subtract like normal. I don't have to worry about that decimal point just yet, so I can just ignore it. 5 plus 2 will, or 5 plus 7, that's 12, so I put the 2 down, carry the 1. 1 plus 4, that's 5. 5 plus 3, that is 8. And now my last step is probably my most important, is I just bring down the decimal. Bring down the decimal. So that's why it's so important that we stack them, we ordered them in that nice line from number 1. Just bring that decimal down and voila, my answer is 8.2. Now, what if I had something that was a little bit different? So let's look at this problem. 12, and I'll change that to black. 12 minus 7.8. Well, right away, I'm going to do my same steps. It's always the same for decimals. So step number 1 is I line up what? I line up decimals. But my problem here is I have one number with a decimal and one number without. So what I could do when I have a number that does not have a decimal, I can add a decimal point at the very end, and I can add as many zeros as I want. 1, 2, 3. They're all going to be equivalent. So I'm going to look. I see one decimal here, so let me write with my line up. So I have my decimal, and here, and now I'm ready to do my operation. But I see a problem. Step number 1, I lined up my decimal. When I go to step number 2, add or subtract like normal, there's a problem. I have this empty spot. What do I do with it? Well, if you remember from right before, I can add as many zeros as I want behind it. So if you're ever left with a spot that is empty, just put a 0 in if it's at the end. So now I can continue. So subtract like normal. 0 minus 8, I can't do that, so I'm going to regroup. So I change that to a 1, this becomes a 10. 2, 1 minus 7, I can't do that, so I'm going to regroup again. So 11 minus 4, that is, or 11 minus 7, that is 4. Now step number 3 is what? I bring down that decimal. And voila, 0, or 1, that decimal point. I just bring that straight down, so my final answer is at 4.2. So what this problem is different is if I don't have a decimal point, like in that 12. I just add a decimal point, and then I add a 0. We're going to do one more, then we'll be done. So my last problem, let's focus on this. I have 13.2 minus 7.11. So step number 1 is what again? I line up those decimals. So here I have 13.2 minus 7.11. And step number 2 is I subtract or add like normal. So I'm just going to ignore those decimal points and carry on with my daily business. But here I have a blank minus 1. So what do? Well, remember, I can add as many zeros as I want at the end. So I add that 0. 0 minus 1 I can't do, so I'm going to regroup. 10 minus 1 now, that is 9. 1 minus 1 is 1. 3 minus 7 I can't do, so I'm going to regroup. 13 minus 7, I can do that, that is 6. And now 3 is I just bring down the decimal. And voila, I will have, that decimal comes straight down, 6 and 1900ths for my final answer. That's it for adding and subtracting decimals. Tomorrow we'll be working on multiplying decimals.